listener can't say, the process of lecture comprehension. Okay, what I'm going to talk about is a very relevant subject, probably to many of you, and that's listening to lectures, listening to academic lectures. And for many students, listening to lectures is one of the hardest listening skills, much harder than your everyday conversational skills. And that's for many reasons. So what I'm going to look at in this lecture are the ways that listening to a lecture differ from listening in other types of situations. Everyday conversations. And then later, in the second part of this lecture, talk about what listeners need to do when they listen to lectures and take notes. Okay, so first, how does listening to a lecture differ from listening in other situations? Okay, let's think about it. First of all, the language. You know that the language is sometimes very different in a lecture as compared to, for instance, talking to friends, talking to people on the street. There's an academic language that we may use. We may use words like on the contrary, nevertheless, instead of simple words like but. Now, this is not to say that lectures never use the word but some lectures may use a more formal level of the language. Also, in lectures, one would expect to hear more specific language, or subject-specific language, or jargon, words that would rarely be found in everyday conversation, but are necessary to talk about a discipline. So language is one thing that differs between lectures and everyday listening. Another thing that's different between the lecture situation and the everyday situation is the interaction between the speaker and the listener. And that's also different. For example, in a lecture situation, the interaction is all unidirectional, meaning that it goes in one direction. All the interaction goes from the lecturer to the listener. The listener has very little role to play. Maybe the lecturer nods his head, but rarely there's no interaction between the two. Okay? In an everyday situation, the participants take turns. Or at least, one participant indicates comprehension and the other continues. It's two-directional, bidirectional interaction. Also, in a lecture, the listener has no control, whereas in everyday speaking situations, if you don't understand, you can ask the speaker to repeat. But in a lecture, a listener can't say, repeat things. They can't say, I don't understand. The listener has no control in a lecture situation. And finally, in a lecture situation, the speaker often talks continuously for a long time, whereas in an everyday situation, usually there are breaks. People take turns, or people react. Okay? Okay, and the last difference between a lecture situation and an everyday listening situation is the expectation. Now, in a lecture situation, you are expected to keep the information for later use. Maybe take notes. You're supposed to remember what you hear. In an everyday listening situation, you need to react right at the moment. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to think about it later. You need to react right then, okay? So in a lecture, you need to write down things so you can remember them for later use. In an everyday situation, you need to react right at the moment. So as you can see, Listening to a lecture is quite different from listening in an everyday situation for everyday purposes. Okay? I'll stop here, and later I'll talk about what a listener needs to do in order to comprehend a lecture efficiently.